everyone. Thank you for joining the Center for Victim Research's interdisciplinary panel on disseminating findings from researcher-practitioner partnerships. My name is Christine Murray, and I'm a professor and research consultant working with the Center for Victim Research to help build a community of collaboration between victim researchers and service providers. In 2018, CVR funded 9 researcher and practitioner fellowship projects, and today we'll be hearing from 3 of these fellows, including Liz Cross, Holly Scheib, and Melissa Torres. In this short 30 minutes that we have together, I'm going to ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves, their agency, and their fellowship focus. Then I'll ask one question of each fellow. Liz, could you please introduce yourself and your fellowship briefly?
Hi, this is Liz Cross. I am the owner of Cross Associates, which is a boutique consulting, evaluation, and research consulting firm located in northern Jersey, serving the tri-state area. I also am an adjunct instructor at Montclair State University, teaching research and evaluation to undergrads as well as graduate students, and soon to be running the senior seminar on child advocacy. So let's see. Most of our work is around victimization services. We have experience evaluating sexual assault nurse examiner programs, all kinds of programs responding to youth victimization. And my background in particular is actually working until recently, developing my own firm and also working at the university. I have served in an executive capacity in a number of very large organizations around evaluating programs that serve children and youth, most of them having been victimized either in abuse or are victims of crime. I think that's enough, yes?
Yes, thank you, Liz. Holly, could you please briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm Holly Scheib, and I'm president of Stage Consulting, which has a 10-year history of program and evaluation work focused on capacity building. I'm former senior faculty with George Washington University's Elliott School for International Affairs, and have been completely independent for about 2 years. My partner in this project, Po Chen, is director of child abuse NGO called Youth Heartline in Taos, New Mexico. Po and I knew each other personally for a number of years, and about 2 years ago, we started exploring ways of working together. He was looking for a measurement partner with a community focus, and I was looking for a community partner to test and further develop my data methods and techniques. And together, we wanted to innovate on efforts to support tribal programs, encouraging sovereignty, and assisting families in ways that rethink child well-being. And that combination created SPIRIT, which stands for Supporting Protection, Integration, and Resources in Tribes.
Great, thank you, Holly. And Melissa, could you please briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Melissa Torres. I'm the director of the Human Trafficking Research Portfolio at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work. We're actually with the Institute of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, which is housed in the School of Social Work, but is also a collective and has partners in other schools and institutes there at UT. So the Human Trafficking Portfolio is actually shared between IDVSA and the Bureau of Business Research at one of the UT think tanks called IC Square, which stands for Innovation, Creativity, and Capital. BVR and IC Square do a lot of business and economics research, and so we thought it was a good place to house the portfolio because we are looking at a lot of our studies are looking at moving away from prevalence, but also looking at economic impact of victimization. And they also partner on a lot of our studies, not just with trafficking, but sexual assault, costs to campuses and state economies, local economies, and cost of services, and how much money is actually stolen through labor trafficking by those that are exploiting. My practitioner partner is Fay Justicia Workers Center, Mariana Leacuña Arriaza, who is the executive director, and we've been partnering on a study with specifically trying to reach out to day laborers working in Houston in post-Harvey and labor abuse and exploitation.
Great. So thank you all for sharing a bit of background about yourselves and your work. And so now we'll get started with the first question, which will be directed to Liz. So Liz, your fellowship work has focused on building data collection and evaluation capacity for a children's advocacy center. How have you been thinking about sharing the work you've been doing with other advocacy centers?
I love this question because that's pretty much all we've been thinking about since we began this project. And I did fail to acknowledge that the fellowship is shared with Carol Berger at Winona's House. Carol is their Chief Program Officer. She's also a former attorney and an attorney who you would think also had an MSW, but just really has a natural talent for thinking about clinical issues and community issues concurrent with appreciating the legal ramifications and outcomes related to child abuse. Speaking of Carol, I'll start with her first. Well, let me just frame this for you. I'm very enthusiastic about this partnership, and Carol and I have been speaking with each other about how to extend this partnership beyond the fellowship time period, and in doing so, it involves, folding in other networks and other people that we know in the state of New Jersey and also nationally. I found myself thinking, when I realized that this is the topic I'd be speaking on, I found myself thinking of dissemination as occurring on two levels. There's the big D of dissemination that occurs through publication and professional presentations, and then there's kind of the little d, although I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, of dissemination that occurs less formally but no less powerfully through networks, teaching, and strong collegial relationships. So I kind of want to start with the little d first. In this fellowship, we were really fortunate to have started with access to a strong network within the child advocacy community. So our senior advisor is Ted Cross. The last name is not an accident. We've been colleagues for 35 years and married for almost 10. So we've been working together a very long time, and Ted served as a senior advisor to the project. And Ted has really been very helpful in helping us build a bridge of communication and learning with the National Children's Alliance throughout this project. So that they're a group that serves all of the child advocacy centers, and they provide certification, training, and technical assistance. They provide a system through which people may enter and maintain their data. They also have an outcome measure system that they require participation in, and it is difficult for them to engage people in participating in that system in a timely and useful way. So we, in a way, sort of treated this as a bit of a laboratory, a very on-the-ground view, for the Children's Alliance on kind of what these obstacles are and the kind of communication that's necessary with the field in order to really build a more robust data collection. And our culminating, we wound up with more culminating products that we knew what to do with, and so we're extending our relationship beyond the fellowship time. One of the things that we plan on writing is a memo to the National Children's Alliance, giving them, our thoughts on what would be helpful in creating a better, deepening their evaluation capacity, and how they might consider offering other ways of training and technical assistance and other methods of managing data that might be more user-friendly to child advocacy centers everywhere. So that's kind of, I think that is sort of a little d, even though it's a big project. Winona's House also has a really strong relationship with the New Jersey chapter of the National Children's Alliance. Nydia Monagas, who is the ED of this chapter, is a colleague of Carol's and mine at Montclair State University. And Montclair State University hosts the only child advocacy studies program in New Jersey, and I believe only one or one of the very few, one of maybe two in the Northeast. So we see the chapter as a venue through which we can disseminate what our experiences have been, both, Carol and I jointly, and help to communicate some of the things that we've learned to these key stakeholders, these child advocacy centers. We also talk about what I've been doing as a teacher of research and evaluation to undergraduates as well as master's students, but more specifically to the undergraduates. Undergraduates are kind of a great untapped resource in some ways for evaluation and data collection in nonprofits. They come, our interns, our students spend a lot of time in their last semester, or at least one semester of the senior year, working in settings like child advocacy centers. Almost every one of, I think almost every child advocacy center in the state has one of our students in it. But they don't get any specific training on, data, logic models. So I've started incorporating data management, data entry, and how to create logic models into the curriculum, into my teaching, and then we'll be working with the department to see if we can sort of really codify that and develop skill sets for the future workforce that are going to really help build capacity in these child advocacy centers, as well as other areas where children might be victimized or victimization services. We have future attorneys in our program as well. So that is also a community of people that don't have the familiarity with data and data management that would be helpful to them. So we feel like we're also building the workforce. So that's another form of small d dissemination. From one thing we'd hope to do this year that unfortunately because of funding we are not able to do is Winona's House hosts a statewide conference of people involved in child advocacy, people who are members of multidisciplinary teams. And unfortunately, they couldn't do one this year. And we were really looking forward to, all of us were looking forward to disseminating what we learned. But we are planning on doing it next year for the statewide conference, so that's lots of people involved, all the key stakeholders, because, child advocacy centers are multidisciplinary centers. So disseminating across disciplines is going to be very important for this, for sharing what we've learned.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Liz. We're kind of at the end of your time, but it was really helpful to hear all of the different ways that you're thinking about dissemination. And
oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
We're also writing papers and presentations, which are the standard disseminations. So I just want to get that in.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. The next question is for Holly. And Holly, your fellowship has focused on working with Native American practitioners and communities. What are the key resources, skills, and practices for disseminating victim research at the community level, and especially within tribal communities?
Thanks, Christine. So dissemination is of great interest to me because I'm committed to work that's actionable, and dissemination is our word for describing the phenomena of knowledge making a difference. Because of that, exploring how engagement and capacity building approaches can be disseminated to support communities is a core aspect of our Spirit program fellowship. Our partner in this process, I failed to say in the beginning, is Taos Pueblo, which is the longest continually inhabited settlement in the United States, and it's currently home to roughly 4,500 tribal members who live on the reservation. So based on our experience with the Spirit approach, we found dissemination to actually be a natural, continuous process with our community. And it's inspired us to apply some thinking to tease apart what dissemination means in this type of process. So Spirit's goals were twofold. One was around influencing program design and measurement, and the other one was around increasing community capacity. And in terms of our goals with program design and measurement, we wanted to provide an actionable structure to a vision of the healthy child within the cultural traditions of Taos Pueblo. We wanted to identify critical measures from strengths-based perspectives, and we wanted to integrate program models into a revised children's code in support of tribal resolutions. In terms of our community capacity goals, we wanted to build trust with community members in the process of identifying what a healthy child is within the context of Taos Pueblo, and build community member capacity in data generation and program development processes. And it's in those last pieces, the community capacity pieces, that's where we found the link to dissemination. Specifically, that because this process included community members and child well-being stakeholders, and used opportunities for engagement as also opportunities for knowledge building, it created ownership of the data and its application from the start. In other words, the ownership of the information, which was built from the ownership of the creation of it, has allowed our participants to become authorities in the workshop project outputs. So they are the ones who are driving the dissemination of our results. So I want to take a step back to talk about the methods because they're critical in understanding what we found in terms of the connections between research engagement and dissemination. So the methods go beyond the broadly defined category of participatory. This is an anti-colonial practice, and that's important because we are working with a Native Pueblo population. It's a dialogic relationship building practice, which is iterative. It's critically reflexive. And the process deconstructs and reconstructs knowledge through multiplicative creative data generation and analysis techniques. And the process takes a lot more time than traditional research or assessment approaches. And it takes a set of skills that aren't common in traditional researchers, nor are common in any kind of research teaching. It challenges the positionality of the researcher as expert and requires an approach that looks to build new knowledge through a combination of science and integrating that science with local realities. So if you look at research as a process of building new knowledge, then you can see it's a very valuable research approach. However, most research just isn't equipped in this regard, and traditional research tends to focus on control and on hierarchy of expertise. And while this approach uses those models as well, it also requires strong self-reflection, awareness of positionality, understanding of a wide range of data, connections between theory and practice, and very strong teaching and facilitation skills. And those things are harder to teach, and they're generally not valued in traditional research training. As a result, our thinking about dissemination tends to be one-sided. Come to my meeting and I'll tell you what I've learned, read my paper, etc. And that fails to make the connections necessary for new knowledge to come alive in tangible ways. So by design, by nature, our approach allows dissemination to be natural because the entire process is about building trust, ownership, and authority among participants. Now, all that said, I don't know that we've accomplished our goals of dissemination yet. So even as we've got this wonderful engagement and interest in using our findings, I think we still have work to be done. Specifically, we found there's a lot more investment needed to support the community to disseminate findings and apply them. So we've whet their appetite, so to speak, but they need more engagement with us as partners to continue the development of skills in leadership, advocacy, and application. So our findings suggest that capacity building approaches are effective in community skills building and commitment to data application, but to have a true dissemination process requires a more integrated long-term approach, and the implications of that more long-term approach are that there has to be interest and support from donors and institutions. So still, I feel like our challenge is a good one to have, that our community is eager to continue our work and it cites great value, novelty, and tangibility in the results. Most importantly, they cite that this process is grounded in the values of Taos Pueblo and has strong cultural appropriateness. In fact, one participant wrote that this was the only appropriate approach for tribal communities. So with that in mind, I feel it's important to have a larger conversation with donors and institutions about their intentions with community-based research and how to better support long-term dissemination to the most impactful result. Thank you.
Great thoughts, Holly. Thanks so much. And now we'll move to our question for Melissa. And so, Melissa, we know that your fellowship focused on the development and initial evaluation of a new intervention to help potential labor trafficking victims in Houston. How are you thinking differently about sharing findings from your work with researchers as compared to practitioners?
Thank you. I won't take up too much time. I know we're at the end, but one thing I really want to say that the big focus for us came out was something we already anticipated, that this population isn't necessarily seen as victims of a crime, or labor trafficking isn't necessarily seen as a type of violence, which we are often pushing. When we talk about trafficking, labor is kind of secondary or tertiary to thoughts on intervention and prevention, and even in research. There's not a lot of funding out there for looking at labor trafficking in particular. And then another problem with that is that it's kind of a silo. Labor is seen as different from sex, and sex is seen as different from labor. And there's so many overlaps, in particular with this population, which is really high at risk for exploitation, which is mostly undocumented Latinos, even though not all are undocumented. But what's come out, which was really unanticipated, was they all, in the focus groups, tended to speak more about mental health than we had anticipated. We were looking at a journal that we have been discussing for years and coming up with some kind of way for them to document what's going on at work. We started with hours and basics that they needed in order for the Worker Center to build a case of labor exploitation or abuse or wage theft, but then also really try to use it as an informative tool and a know your rights type of go-to place, right? It had information on resources, who they could call, basic rights, basic laws and policies they should know, information on what the Worker Center needed to build a case for them if there was any kind of wage theft or labor abuse. But then there were questions about how did they feel that day, what were some of the things that they noticed at work, or what was the environment like at the labor site or at the corner where they were looking for work, or friends that referred them, to get them to think a little bit more of just hours. One of the things that was kind of contradictory to what we wanted to do was our focus was in labor in Houston after Harvey, and we really, really wanted to focus on the most vulnerable, who are day laborers, because they don't have steady work or steady jobs or resources most of the day, and other workers might have a little bit more not secure work but stable work and working for the same family or same company or same contractors. We only had about 2 day laborers out of the groups coming in, and they weren't very consistent because of their hours. But that turned out to be one of the findings. The rest of the workers were talking about, other members who are day laborers needing this tool, but that it had to be a lot more than just making it available. It had to be outreaching to them and teaching them why this is important, and getting them to think more about mental health and how that impacts everything else, because the workers talked a lot about, I know something's wrong, but I don't know how to say it, and then I get frustrated, and then I just forget it, but then this builds up, and then I don't document everything I need for a case. So that's something that should be important to research, and disseminating that, how these are issues that are not happening in silos, and they're all factors that lead up to what perpetrators take advantage of and how they take advantage of them. But also for practitioners to know that, yes, they're coming to practitioners with cases or with issues that they need help with, but a lot of times they're not looking at the intersecting factors themselves, that the stress that is caused, by personal life they're not looking at what's happening at work, or we kind of tend to just blow it off as, that's part of life. But they're not connecting it to not knowing their rights, because when they started to learn as they started to learn their rights through the journal and started to talk more at the focus groups, a lot of them became empowered and started telling us month by month, or focus group by focus group, I should say, how they started standing up to their employers and fighting for their rights. So another unanticipated finding of this is that the focus groups themselves, obviously it was a method and a tool for us to do the research, but for them themselves, because the Worker Center is a member center, it became almost a support group, and it became a way for them to educate and empower themselves using the journal. So that's something that we're now looking at and implementing at the Worker Center in future programs, and how we're going to promote the journal and our next steps with it in doing outreach. And we've also applied for another research grant to kind of move this to the next phase, where it is focused on outreach to day laborers themselves, and we will be doing this type of intervention and education and interviews regarding mental health and labor at labor sites with them. So hopefully we can get that funding, and if not, we'll definitely look in other places to do that. But we've taken a lot of the information that's come out of the focus groups and discussed how to implement it, not only at the Worker Center services, but how do we talk about this with local anti-trafficking coalitions, and how do we stress the need for researchers through the dissemination? How do we stress the need for researchers to pay more attention to labor trafficking and the different ways that it impacts people, other than just getting a criminal case done and someone charged, but how it impacts them emotionally with their mental health and in how they perceive their rights.
Thanks, Melissa. Great to hear your thoughts on how you're thinking about all of that. Since we have about 5 minutes left, I wanted to see if each of our 3 panelists could just briefly, in a sentence or two, share what is one piece of advice that you would have for other researcher practitioner partnerships for disseminating findings. So let's start again with Liz. In a sentence or two, do you have a piece of advice that you would share? Oh, Liz, you might be on mute. Well, let's move ahead to Holly. Do you have a piece of advice that you might share about dissemination?
Sure, absolutely. I would begin any project with dissemination in mind. So be thinking about who the audience is, who you want to engage, who's going to make the information useful, and determine what kind of information that comes out is useful, and involve them from the beginning so that when you get to the point where you're looking to disseminate, everyone's already at the table and engaged.
Great, thanks. That's a great suggestion. Melissa, how about you? Do you have a quick final thought?
Back to, I think it's, the Worker Center isn't necessarily, the narrative that they have isn't necessarily around victimization or crime. It's wage theft, which a lot of the times the population that's highest at risk don't see themselves as victims and really don't understand their rights as a crime. So we tend to have this lens that, once you're educated, that it's really hard to unsee what you see. But just remember, in working with these populations, that, the narrative a lot of times that we give them isn't their own language or their own experience. So, like I said, a lot of the things that we heard were unanticipated. So let them address it. If it's a case where they're not aware that they're a victim of a crime or a type of violence, help them find that language that they haven't had for those experiences.
Thanks, Melissa. And Liz, it looks like you're off of mute now. Do you have a final 1 or 2 sentences piece of advice to share?
A piece of advice for, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, a piece of advice for other researcher practitioner partnerships for dissemination.
I think, our fellowship was, did not involve clients directly. It worked with the staff and the administration mostly. And so I think an important thing to recognize in organizations that serve people who have been victims of crime, who have been victims of child abuse, is to really privilege and honor the voices of the staff when disseminating, vet products with people who you've been working with, even if they're not the other fellow, and use them as, not use them, but invite them to be dissemination partners.
Great, thank you. And I want to just conclude things by thanking Liz, Holly, and Melissa and for representing the CVR Fellows and joining this meeting, and for sharing your knowledge and your experiences with all of us. To everybody who's listening, I invite you to please visit the Center for Victim Research website at www.victimresearch.org. to find more tools and tips on research and evaluation, as well as access to CVR's library of research materials.